Hello again, this is Noel with creationeffects.com. In the previous videos, I've explained how you can make some really cool lens flare effects using the Creation Lens Flares template for After Effects. But while playing with this template, there's a number of cool tricks I discovered that perhaps didn't really fit into any of the other tutorials. So I made a list of 10 tips that I want to share with you now. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on details, so I'm going to try to stay brief as I go down the list. You can give an anamorphic streak to all the brightest areas of your footage by using the automatic lens flare feature found in this folder in the project panel. You'll find some basic controls on the control layer like streak length and brightness, threshold. You can change the color and the option to make the streaks vertical. And to use this feature, just open the comp that says put your footage here and drop in your footage. Then open the other comp called Your Footage with Lens Flare, and the streaks will be there. Now if there's a part of your footage that's too bright and is creating unwanted streaks, like this opening to the cave here, you can just mask it out in the pre-comp. And I'll feather that a bit, and I'll invert it. And then in the final comp, you can put a copy of the footage without the mask below the other layers. Now this feature works best on darker footage that has a few really bright spots on it. Let's take a look at another quick example here. I've got this subway train footage, and there's quite a few bright spots on here, but I just want streaks on the headlights. So I'll draw a quick mask over where the headlights are. And I'll go to my final comp and put my original footage at the bottom. And then I'll just lessen the effect by turning down the brightness. And I'm done. Often when you see real lens flares, the bright light washes out the color and contrast of the footage. Now sometimes a glow element can do the trick, but I think you can get a more authentic look using an adjustment layer and some color correction. Just go up to Layer, New, and Adjustment Layer, and then position it over your footage. And there's a number of effects you can use, like tint or hue saturation. I personally like the brightness and contrast, used with the photo filter effect. And I'll turn the brightness way up, and the contrast way down. And I'll change the color on the photo filter, and turn up the density. And obviously this looks horrible, so we need to add an alpha matte element so that this only shows in the area around the light source. I'm going to set the proximity to 50 so that it stays on top of the light source, and I'll make it much bigger and feather it out. And I'll set my adjustment layers track matte to alpha matte. And that's it. You can turn any image or any part of your footage into a lens flare reflection just by copying over the controls from another element. So what are the applications for that, since not everyone wants to use a floating baby head in their lens flare? I mean, most of you probably do, but there might be some of you that don't. Well, if the light in your footage maybe has a unique texture or shape, and not that this one does, but if you had one, you can isolate it and then use that as a reflection. Or here, I have this still image from a real lens flare that I shot. If I want to convert this shape here to a reflection, I can just draw a mask around it and feather it a little bit. And it's a little off center, so in order to make it move and rotate right later on, I'll drag it to the center, and I'll pre-compose the layer by going to the Layer menu and then pre-compose. And then I'll go to my Elements comp and open up my Reflection Solid layer. And I'll copy the effects and transform properties, and then I'll go back and paste them in my image layer. And what's really cool is these controls now work on this reflection. It's too dark, so I'll increase the brightness and decrease the softness. And I don't need extra color on this, so I'll turn off this photo filter down here. And the blending mode can be set to whatever you want. I'll choose Add. And you can see it works just like a reflection solid now that you can add to your lens flare. I briefly mentioned the texture feature of the reflection particles array element in the Introduction to Elements tutorial. Let's look at it again. Here's some footage walking through a trellis with some vines. And I have a reflection particles array here. I'm going to put my light source way up here in the sky. And I'll open up my particles array layer and open up effects. And then underneath all my slider controls way at the bottom here, I'll open the CC particle world effect and then open particle. And I want to change the type to one of the textured types. Now since there's an expression in here, I have to turn that off first. And then I'll select textured disk and I'll open up texture and I'll select my footage layer as the texture layer. And let me hide the footage layer so you can see it better. So now if I scale this down, you can see it basically overlaid the footage on top of the reflections. And you can set the rotate speed. And I think I'd rather use the colors of the footage, so I'll turn off this photo filter effect down here. And I'll change the burst color to white. And that still doesn't look very good right now, so I'll actually scale it way back up. And I'll put it at 99.5%. And now when we play it, we have this nice organic texture which kind of makes the reflections twinkle in a way that matches the footage. There's a common look in lens flares where reflections seem to get cut off as they move away from the light source. And there's a couple of ways to do that here. First, you can go to the Elements comp and copy an alpha matte element and then just put that directly above your reflection. And the alpha matte moves just like a normal reflection, so just position it so that it's close to your reflection, and then set the scale and softness to whatever you want. And then set the track matte on the reflection element to alpha matte. And you can also use the spotlight effect from the effects library. Just copy all the controls under the spotlight effect title and paste them into your element. And if you set render to light only, you'll be able to see the actual light. So whatever is in the area of the light will be visible. I'll use these controls in the spotlight effect to control the size and the softness. And then I'll use these proximity sliders to move it closer to the reflection. And when you're ready, just set render back to light shadow. Both of these methods get the job done, and I'd say they're equally easy to do. Perhaps the biggest application for lens flares is not compositing onto footage, but using in graphic design. So how do you export a still in After Effects? Well, all you need to do after you design your flare and you have it positioned where you want it, you just go to the composition menu and save frame as. Now something everyone should understand is that this template was designed for 1920 by 1080 HD, and it's not going to work the same in other resolutions. It's still usable in other resolutions, I think, but you're going to notice some funny changes. So if you need a high-res lens flare, you can increase the comp size by going to Composition and Composition Settings. And you can see these reflections don't line up anymore. And some of the other presets might look even weirder than this once you change the resolution of the comp. The controls still work, so you can resize everything. And usually you can just drag elements to where they should be if they get displaced. The problems will vary depending on which effects and which elements you're using, so you might need to get a little creative when you're fixing them. Speaking of displacing elements, sometimes that can be a really cool effect. Let's look at this reflection shape array. I'll open up the contents so we can see the individual shapes, and if I grab one of the shapes, I can drag it outside the array path, or I'll just use my arrows to offset it a bit. Lens flares often have stray reflections that aren't really in line, and you can see it kind of gives it that 3D look when I move it around. The glow effect may be the most used effect in the presets. I'll go to the effects library and copy the controls underneath this glow effect title. And I'll paste them onto a reflection shape array. The glow is strongest when it's on something bright, so there's a good amount of glow here when the reflections are close together, but it kind of goes away when they scatter. So we want the threshold to get lower as the reflections move away from the center. So I'll decrease the threshold evolution. And that's pretty nice, but I think I'll change the color to a blue and make this a horizontal glow. And so now we have these automatic anamorphic streaks on our element. I sort of stumbled on this way to make a starburst shape with arms of varying lengths. I added this pucker and bloat effect, and when you play around with that slider control in conjunction with your other reflection controls, you can come up with a variety of looks. Usually when you see these expanding rings in lens flares, they get narrower close to the light source and wide out here. I haven't yet figured out a way to build that property into the element, and so I would usually try to hide the base by increasing the completion amount, and that would look better. I did eventually figure out a kind of workaround. Once you're finished adjusting the settings of your expanding ring, duplicate it and turn the brightness way up, and then just use your duplicate ring as an alpha matte by going to the original ring and setting the track matte to alpha inverted matte. Now just decrease the scale amount on the duplicate to make it smaller, and then the width will taper off toward the base.